it will be broadcasting. So anyway, Chuck, go ahead.
All right. Okay, so I've decided to present on Drupal, and as a so as a Drupal developer and part of the kind of the Unicon Drupal team, I really have just maybe 1 foot in the door on the UX team, and then 1 foot into the developer out, on the kind of the back end for Drupal. Um, I guess my roots are in the UX team, but I don't do a lot of UX like most of you are deeply ingrained into the JavaScript and the other UX elements. But I think Drupal does fit very well into UX, so I wanted to kind of just talk about some of the features that it has and the newest version that is not fully released yet. We're hoping in the very near future will be in a stable release, but some of the features that it offers and how that might work with Unicon and how we might be able to use it. First thing I will throw out there, a couple disclaimers. Like I mentioned, Drupal 8 is still not necessarily in development. It's in a release candidate, but still unstable. So we don't have a lot of contributed modules and a lot of things like that that make Drupal so powerful. So it's still, this version of Drupal 8 is still early on. And then the other one that the other disclaimer I'll throw out there is that I work from home and am on Comcast cable and somehow managed to drop about half of the meetings I'm in. Thank you, Comcast. So I'll just throw that out there. If I drop, I'll join right back on. But I managed to do just fine during the day, and then as soon as I get on a meeting, it seems to drop off. But so a quick intro to Drupal 8. If you're familiar with Drupal, um, let's make the assumption that we're kind of introducing Drupal in the first place and why we're going why we would use Drupal. So Drupal is an enterprise content management system, content management framework. Depending on who you ask, you get different terms. And sorry, before I continue, I will throw out that I do want as much participation and questions and anything you guys have. Feel free to stop me and or put something in the chat, whatever, and so we can discuss. Drupal's content management system, running on PHP and MySQL database most often. Well, it can be used in other database configurations. One of the most powerful things, or one of the most powerful features of the Drupal CMS is its community. Off the website recently, over 97,000 contributors, active contributors, over 2,500 commits to Drupal core in the last week, over 5,000 comments on Drupal.org in the last week. So it is a very involved and very active community. Some of the websites that you will see done in Drupal: Weather Channel, weather.com, whitehouse.gov, georgia.gov. It's just some of the government websites. Higher education, I don't know that you can find more than a couple universities in the nation that don't use Drupal. It's a very popular CMS, especially on the higher ed campuses. ASU is a huge user and contributor in the higher ed space. So it is very popular in certain circles for certain things. And I think where Drupal becomes so popular is that it can be used for just about everything. I mentioned that it's enterprise, and you find it in websites like weather.com and some of these that have very high traffic and high availability. You also find it in your average restaurants and small businesses, homemade or homegrown type blogs and things like that. So it can be used for just about everything. So if any questions on what Drupal is, we'll go ahead and go into some of the developments recently within Drupal. So Drupal 7 is the current version. Very well supported, like I mentioned, it's a large contributor community. There are thousands, I don't know the exact number, of contributed modules that you can add on into Drupal in Drupal 7. Well, as they developed Drupal 8, there was a large group of the core developers and the kind of the governing body that really was pushing towards more of an enterprise, adopting a lot of the PHP standards out there, and this is really what Drupal 8 is. It's introducing it uses Symfony, which is a PHP framework that I would say is probably the most prevalent, one of the more prevalent PHP frameworks at the time for theming, rather than its own previous homegrown theming approach, which was PHP template. It now uses Twig, which is a well adopted and well used PHP templating language. It moves a lot of its config files into YAML files, and rather than what previously used was kind of a .info file that was, again, more of a homegrown solution rather than kind of a community standard. Guzzle is another one of these technologies that is, like Symfony, is a popular choice in the PHP community at large. So by introducing these, the hope was to pull in more of your PHP developers in the community, and go away from Drupal having its own ecosystem that had a very steep learning curve separate from PHP. So if you were even an experienced PHP developer previously, it was a lot of work to figure out how Drupal worked, and there was a lot of hacking and some really ugly code because of that. So the idea was to really pull these things in. With that, they lost, Drupal 8 loses a lot of the simplicity that Drupal 7 offered. Familiarity and simplicity, because we are now pulling in different projects. There's a build process. Sometimes it can get a little more complicated to have the different projects incorporated, and for those who were more of an old school functional based rather than object-oriented programming, Drupal 8 really introduces a large leap in understanding the back-end code and how to add on to it and create modules and things like that. Unfortunately, that's kind of where I fall. It's where I learned PHP and Drupal about the same time, about 10 years ago, back at Drupal 4, and I've very familiar with how Drupal works and how PHP works within Drupal. I'm not as familiar with things like Symfony and Twig, and so there's going to be, for myself, a learning curve that will be difficult for Drupal 8. Well, it turns out that there was a kind of a backlash against this move towards enterprise, and there were a group of people who really wanted something simpler and along the lines of taking Drupal more towards a WordPress, which is focused on the user experience and a UI rather than focusing on the back end and performance and things like that. And so they actually forked Drupal. In Drupal 7, they created what they call Backdrop. Backdrop CMS is really a simpler version of Drupal 7 that has a lot of features built in, but doesn't have the same functionality moving forward. It's kind of a toss-up. It really, there are going to be projects where Backdrop makes more sense than spinning up a full Drupal 8 instance, and it's just a simpler interface and focus on just kind of your small to medium-sized websites rather than an enterprise solution. Any thoughts or questions on that?
What do you think about that, Chuck? Like, I guess just my natural thought as someone who's been involved with some different code bases and community projects and things, like forking it like that seems like the wrong idea. I mean, I get why they probably did it, but having two versions of your product and potentially sort of two different code bases, splitting your efforts across sort of two different goals, right? Almost opposite ends of the spectrum, right? And so I'm just curious, what do you guys? I don't know enough about it to weigh in on whether overall I think that's good or bad. But what are your thoughts on that?
I wish that there was a way that they could take the effort going into Backdrop and improve the Drupal 8 UI. But I do understand, some very smart people and very some big players that went into Backdrop that were on the Drupal space. And I understand that they just really felt like the direction of Drupal 8 was not the direction they wanted to go, didn't fit their needs. So I see myself in the near future, based on the project, choosing between the two. I think there will be projects, if I'm doing my uncle's website for his law firm, I'm going to pick up Backdrop and throw something together, and it's going to be simple. If I'm going to be building a front end for UCLA or something like that, then I'm going to go with Drupal 8, and it'll be interesting to see. It reminds me of 8 or 10 years ago, there was along with Drupal, there was the other CMS that was very popular at the time was Mambo, and the executive board for Mambo decided they were going to go a certain direction. There was a group that didn't like that direction, didn't like where it was going. They forked and created Joomla, and very quickly Mambo died and Joomla took off.
Yeah.
So forking isn't always a bad thing, I think. Especially in this, when you have two very good motives, just going in slightly different directions.
Yeah, I'll add my 2 cents in from a little bit different perspective. Is that Well, I understand why they're doing it. Drupal 8 is they really are taking aim at the enterprise. And the original thought was that Backdrop would fill the role of the smaller companies, like what Chuck said, is these smaller sites aren't going to have the money to completely retool their sites. But one thing that I've been a little bit disappointed in, and Chuck, I don't know if you have any thoughts on it, is that all the D7 modules still have to be ported over as well, or most. So there's still a fair amount of work in Backdrop. But I think they both have some legs and will persist for a while.
Sounds a lot like the Python 2-3 split.
Yeah, I mean,
it's too much effort for some of the modules.
The other thing too is that Drupal 8. So Dries has his own company now, Acquia, and I'm sure they have funded a large portion of the Drupal 8 work as well. But for developers, especially for front-end developers, what I heard at the conferences over the last 2 years is that it's like relearning a new product all over again.
Sure. Drupal 8.
Drupal 8 is, yeah. Because Symfony and Twig and it's all different. And I think Chuck, you even mentioned the fact that you've got to relearn a bunch of stuff for Drupal 8.
Yeah, honestly, as I consider myself an experienced Drupal developer, it scares me a little bit to have to go into a new project that I don't feel comfortable in. So there's going to be a high learning curve for everyone involved.
I heard someone make a comment that a developer that's been doing this for a long time, said that someone coming fairly new into Drupal right now has an advantage over developers that have been doing this for a long time.
That's not what I want to hear. It's a little scary.
Well, you have to unlearn a bunch of stuff, right?
I know.
And then relearn, and where they're just learning.
No, and it's very true, but I think that Drupal 8 is very exciting. What's out there, what we have ahead of us is going to be a difficult learning curve. But I do think for the most part, I will be using Drupal 8. That would be my final 2 cents, is that I think I will make myself learn that the challenges, whatever it is that we may face in learning how to develop for Drupal 8, but I think it's the project that's going to have the most longevity. So I look forward to really diving into 8 and figuring things out. So for this example, we'll talk a little bit about some of the features that are new to Drupal 8, and this doesn't really get into all that Drupal does because we don't have time to go into every detail, every feature that it has. But some of the new things that are introduced into Drupal 8 is really a mobile focus, meaning that before Drupal was always able to be mobile and handle that responsive very well, but that was done at the theme level. So you would build a theme and you'd have to kind of incorporate that there. Based on the theme that you picked, you would have to build that in, or pick contributive modules to handle things. Well, they've done a better job of building that in so that we can see, the images are handled, the responsive images are handled at the core level within Drupal. It's a core module. The administrative theme, which I'll log in a minute and kind of show that off. It's also responsive, which is huge. It used to be that if you were on on a Saturday, you get a phone call saying, "Hey, I need this done on this website," or "This needs to be fixed," and you're on your phone trying to log in, and you're zooming in and zooming out and zooming in, and it was, you know, a giant pain trying to work in the admin function. Even if the website itself was responsive, the administrative theme typically wasn't. So that's nice. And then they also have responsive tables, meaning that you can, by default, some things, some of the columns wrap or go away based on kind of a primary, secondary priority. So that's also a nice feature. Inline text editing. So Drupal decided to go with the CK editor, the inline text editor, and this is actually built in now. Before, this was always a challenge in that you had to go and add these contributed modules to make this work. So you didn't have text inline, or you didn't have a rich text editor out of the box. They've fixed that now so that luckily you can. And I'll go ahead, actually, let me just log in really quick, and we'll show this off a little bit. First off, we see we have here's our toolbar, and this is just this is basically core Drupal 8. I haven't added, well, I've added one contributed module for that helps with REST, but for the most part, this is out of the box. So we can see that as we go smaller, it does go responsive fairly well. So we have our toolbar that we can turn on and off, and things are kept fairly well in here. And our columns stack, and you know it's responsive. We also have inline editing, so that I can come in here and say, you know what, I don't like that. Okay, let's see. Oh, so this was a block. Oh, this is the page title block. Okay, so here's actual text. I can click this and do a quick edit, and get my toolbar, and then come in here and change. Of course, as in a demo, there we go. So now I can make changes. Click Save, and this is all done in line. Very nice features. The REST features, REST services, web services are also built in, and we'll demo that a little bit more, and that's kind of what we refer to as the concept of headless Drupal. So there are a couple of different ways that you can obviously integrate REST and kind of a more dynamic AJAX website. You can do that directly in the theme, so that you can have AJAX features here, but have the page rendered still by Drupal. Just introduce some, a few different REST calls to make the page a little more dynamic. Or you can actually just use this to manage content and build an entirely different UI and just pull this content in. And this is becoming a fairly popular concept in truly making Drupal just the content manager and not necessarily the presentation layer. So we'll get into that in just a minute, more of the REST options. Config management is also a big one. So the headache of Drupal, and those of you who may have worked on a Drupal project have experienced this. You build your website in a dev environment, and Drupal, in its ability to be flexible, it lets you build content types and fields and extend it in lots of different ways. And all of that is stored in the database. Well, now in the database you have content and configuration, and there was no good separation, so it was a hassle to move from dev to staging to production. They finally figured this out so that you can now export your configuration into YAML files, and those can be stored and imported back in, and so the configuration is still done at the database, or stored in the database, but if you have files, those YAML files, the configuration will be used. That configuration will be used as well. So it definitely helps with the management of these larger enterprise sites when you're moving around from dev to production. And of course, the configuration can be saved in source control, and that's essential as well in a large project. As I mentioned, Drupal is very flexible as a content manager. The entity system, basically anything that is built in Drupal, any content that is managed, users, they are stored as entities, and you can add fields. So from your user, you can add different fields to them and allow a personalized profile, a type of a biography per user. You can add fields to comments, to different node content types that you've created. There's a lot of flexibility in what you can do, and then of course what you can build with that, how you can query it and organize the content and pull it all together. One feature that I don't have on here is the fact that views, so within Drupal, Drupal comes with it now comes with basically a query manager, which they call views. And views essentially allows you to pull your content together, create lists of content, fields, filter by context, by user, permissions, all kinds of different filters that are available, and pull these into lists like an events calendar or your personalized list of content that you've added, or favorites, or whatever it may be. So this is a powerful feature that has been in Drupal for quite a while, but it's always been a contributed module until now. Now it's built in, and because of that, it gives us some great flexibility in the ability to introduce it to the REST modules and some of the other things that we have available here. All right, any questions on the Drupal features? Is there anything that when you think of a CMS, you're wondering, hey, does Drupal do this, or do they handle this well? Let me know, and we'll see if we can answer that. All right, we'll take that silence as we're ready to move on. But definitely stop me at any point if you have questions on that kind of thing.
Well, Chuck, maybe from you knowing the platform maybe better than the rest of us, and at least my exposure to Drupal is more or less like, you can think of something that it should do, it has a module that does that for the most part. So like, I think about anything you could toss out for a CMS, Drupal would say, yes, it does that. Do you know of anything that you wish that it did that it doesn't have a module for or doesn't support in some way?
That's a good question. Occasionally there are random things that I come across that either they don't do or they don't do well. Meaning that somebody came across a missing feature, built a module, and then abandoned it, and it's 5 years old now and doesn't work very well. That happens occasionally. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. There are a lot of things that I wish it did better. Commerce. There is a Drupal commerce module or a set of modules that is very powerful, is a beast to use, to set up. I wish that were simplified and cleaned up a little bit. That's if people complain, this one of the largest complaints I hear, the most common complaint I hear about Drupal is that it's difficult to use, it's cumbersome, it's built for developers, and that's very true. It's not intuitive. There is a learning curve. More than in any specific functionality that Drupal is missing, it's just missing ease of use.
Yeah. So there's 32,202 modules, but what I run across is everybody says, oh, Drupal can do that, Drupal can do that. The problem that I run into is that when someone creates a module, it's usually for a specific use case.
Yeah.
And you've got to go in and make it do what you want it to do, so that involves modifying or updating or whatever.
Understanding their code and then tweaking it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's what I've seen. Chuck, have you used Commerce Kickstart at all, or Kickstart 2?
No, I haven't.
Okay. So
No,
that extrapolates up, and there's a company that's built around Commerce Guys that do this. And the project that we did last year for Glenline, we used Kickstart, and it makes it infinitely easier. And what they did is what Drupal should have done, is they've extracted up and made it easier for the users to use Commerce. It takes the pain that he was talking about, not completely out of the equation, but a lot of it out of the equation. It puts a front end on it that you can hand that store to somebody, and for the most part, they could maintain that store.
That's good to know. I need to try a Commerce Kickstart. So that's the good and bad about such a large community is that you have people trying to solve and answer a lot of different questions and a lot of different features. So you find modules that are variations of each other, and usually after a year or two, one will fade out and the other will be supported because it provided a better set of features or was just better supported in general. And that's kind of a good part about the community is that you do have this kind of the survival of the fittest. But occasionally ones that you do want also get neglected and fall to the wayside as well. One of the challenges I find is that you find there are often very large modules that encompass a lot of features. You want to handle groups, and these groups are able to create their own kind of intranet or kind of their own little sub-sites. Well, there's a module called organic groups, and organic groups handles that plus 1,000 other things. So if you want part of the functionality, you end up installing the entire module and trying to figure out how to turn off everything else. That's a challenge, but I think that probably is a challenge of any CMS or any modular system.
You were going to say.
I was just gonna say, I feel like that's one of the there's like pros and cons to having a low barrier to entry for publishing modules. Like you see it with NPM too, where it's like it's so dead simple that there's just like there's some really good ones out there, and you see them kind of rising to the top, especially when they have like a feature like top, like most used or whatever, highest rated. But then, like I feel like with Linux, like publishing a package to like a package repository is not for the faint of heart. So, right.
Standard.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I do wish it, and they've tightened down a little bit the Drupal.org managers on who can publish modules to Drupal.org, and that's actually been a good thing. It's not open to anyone with a username to go in there. They can create the sandbox and they can submit modules, but it does go through an approval process and a testing process. You do have to pass certain unit tests and things like that to be able to get that on Drupal.org now. So that's a good thing. And the interesting side effect of that is you find a lot more modules not on Drupal.org, but actually on GitHub. And that's starting to kind of shift a little bit to the point where Drupal.org is considering, I think it's going to happen in the future where modules will be managed on GitHub, and then they'll just be listed on Drupal.org. So rather than trying to manage everything through this website. All right, so let me go ahead and we're going to go into the demonstration of some of the REST features. Simply, I have here what I had hoped to do when I agreed to do this presentation, and thought, it would be really cool to do just a simple Angular page that pulled in content and all of this, and realized, oh, that's okay, Angular shouldn't be that hard, to just put a very basic page that pulls content. And then I realized that for you guys it's probably not that hard. For me it was. I got stuck very quickly, and more stuck on getting Drupal's REST APIs to work than I did with Angular. So unfortunately I don't have a kind of a live demo of pulling content into an actual website. I'll leave that to anyone who wants, who can probably whip that up in a half hour. So I'll just go ahead and show off the REST API through, let's see, where have we got our DHC, our viewer in Chrome. So we're going to go ahead and go to, let's see, we're going to pull this. So all we're really doing at this point is pulling a node, which is basically a page, a content type. All content entities in Drupal are called nodes. So your pages, your articles, your events, whatever content type you've created, they all have a node ID, and you can pull that specifically with that. You can also specify the format. At this point, I think everything is HAL JSON. I think you can do XML, but we'll go ahead and we can see this pulling down. So here we have our JSON object with our HAL data of The type of content is a page. It has a unique user ID. And then you have the title. So basically you have a lot of information here. This is basically the entire page or node entity, all the data that comes with it. When we scroll down here, we can see the status and when it was created and when it was last changed. And then finally, the body, we can actually get the content for that page. And we can do that for any of the nodes we have. So very easily from a separate application, we can pull content in, and we can also, with some basic authentication, post content and do that. So you can see that the format here, essentially we're just doing a get on the actual node. So if we were to go to this node/7 in a browser, that's going to show us, display us that page. By adding our little parameter here of format and then doing a get, that's when we actually get the JSON. So if we go into our post, so we have basic authentication set up, and then we've labeled this as held.json. In the body here, I've just essentially said this is an article content type. I've given it a title, and then again I've specified that the target ID of this is an article. And so now I can go ahead and send that, and it'll take a few seconds because my internal network's a little slow. And we can see that I got a 201 response. So we can kind of go back into our Drupal, look at our content, and we just got a new article published. So that's what we just did. So now we can do the same thing with updating through a patch. We can do deleting content through that. Let's see if we can go ahead and actually let's see what. So this article that we just created is node 13. So we'll come in here, do the same thing, but we'll go ahead and send a delete. And we should get back a 204, no content, which means that that content is deleted. And we can go back in here just to double check. And sure enough, that node is now gone. So we have our standard CRUD functionality available to us. We can log in and log out. In my testing, like I said, I struggled a little bit in getting all of the REST functionality to work as I expected in Drupal 8. Learning curve, there were some permissions there that I failed to set properly, and so it was just more of a struggle than I thought. I got the login to work just fine. For some reason, I couldn't get the log out to work. So there's still some learning to do to go along with that. And then the other, so it's not just nodes. You can pull user information doing the same thing, and then you can do this for essentially any entity. You could pull comments. You could pull, taxonomies. the great thing is you can pull menus. So you could truly use Drupal to manage all of your content, your structure, and not just the text and images, but the actual organization of the content, and then pull in a menu and use that menu to request additional specific pages. So anyway, we just got a user. Yeah, so here's our name, admin, and then all of our information. And if we had additional fields added onto this, they would show up as well. So if we had a full profile, then it would all be part of this entity JSON object. So that's all great. Nothing revolutionary there. Nothing that really captures Drupal's abilities or anything too fancy there, until you really get into the views. So views, I mentioned earlier, is your listing capability, your ability to create lists and filter and narrow things down that way. So we're going to go ahead and let's come in here and look at what a view looks like. So we're going to go to Structure and Views. So we have a view created here, which I called a REST view. So we'll go ahead and look at that. So the way that Drupal views work, you give it some basic information. You're going to, in this case, typically the view is made for rendering on the page, rendering through standard Drupal theming and displaying it within the page, either as a block in the left or right column, or as a menu, or as the main body of the page. Views has a lot of other functionality. It can be used for slideshows, it can be used for calendars, and there's a lot that can be done and is done in Drupal with the views. In this case, we can create a view and then choose for our format. We've chosen this as a serializer. So because this is a REST export type of view, then sort of serializer is our option. And then we can get into the settings and we can say, for this we want XML, JSON, and HAL JSON. And so basically, depending on the header that's passed in, it will return this by default. And I think, or it will return one of these three. We can, if we leave it blank, then it will default, I believe, to just JSON. And then we can choose whether we want the entire entity, which we had been dealing with previously, to be passed back, or specific fields. For right now, we'll just look at the entity. We can filter, and this is where things get a little more interesting. Of all the content that is in that you may be storing in Drupal, here's where you can start filtering down. You can use contextual filters, meaning that you pass in a user ID that you want the content for that user ID. You may pass in a specific search term and you only want content with that search term, or whatever it may be. Here's where you can really narrow that down. We can get into the advanced areas where you can create relationships with other nodes. So you can say, you may have in your content, let's say you have an LMS, you have course and assignments and different student submissions. Well, you can pass in an assignment and then say, I want an assignment ID, and say I want all the submissions that are related to this assignment. So you can use relationships if you have references or things passed in between different types of content. You can pull those in. There's a lot that can be done here. I don't have any advanced configuration here to show some of those features. So here we can see we're basically just filtering off the articles, and then that they are published, and we're sorting by the author. We have it set up for access, that anyone who can view content, published content, can view this. We could change this to a very specific group of people who can view this. We'll go ahead and save that. And then come back here. Oh, so one other thing that we did here is we gave it a path. So rest/views/articles is our path to this view. So we're going to come and hit that same path. And you can do this in the browser. It doesn't have to be a specific to a curl or a tool like this. That's one interesting thing about the views, is that it is get only. So you can't post or delete onto a view. This right here is essentially just for pulling content, lists of content. So here we can do, to pull this content, and we will see that, yeah, we got an array of, how many objects? 2 objects. 2 articles that got brought in. And this, so what basically was is an array of the full entity that was brought in. Now the other option, as we talked about, we have the entity here. We can also do fields. So let's say we've selected fields rather than entities. So here we have the choice between entity, fields, or search results. So you can use this to pull in search results from Drupal's core search functionality. When we go into settings, we can also create aliases for these. So if we have very long fields, field names, things that are not easy to use or easy to understand, and we can choose whether how those are going to be referenced through the REST API. So I've gone ahead and created this separate view, or this is actually called a display of the same view, meaning they share a lot of the same features, but you can override certain aspects of them. So we're displaying this content. We're going to display the number, any tags, node ID, any comments that were added. And then for each of these, we can specify the format. Do we want it just plain text, or do we actually want a specific type of name or a linked content? So this right here is, is linking to the content, so we can see that when we come back to, so this right here is the second display that we created. We'll go ahead and click that. And now we see we get a much shorter list. We're not getting the entire entity. We're only getting those fields that we added, which makes working with this text a lot more manageable. we also see that as we had the checkbox checked for linking to the content, the title got passed back as an actual a URL, an HTML tag. So we have that, you know, you can send raw text, you can send actual HTML, fully rendered HTML, whatever you need to in here. And then in here, the second one, we can see that we actually had comments. So we have the full body of HTML body of comments that can be displayed for this node. And then we also had tags as well. So the taxonomy terms are listed, as well as the comments and other things. So that's where there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of capability in using Drupal as your content management source. Any questions on that?
No.
Okay. So again, like I said, I think it would have been great to have the demo of what that actually does, but I think you guys understand way better than I do where that could be used with Angular and with your different applications. So what I wanted to do, kind of just to close this up, is have a little discussion on. So this is what Drupal can do. Does it make sense? Does it fit into any of the projects you're working on or that you've talked about, that you have in the pipeline? We're really trying to figure out how Drupal can be used at Unicon with the projects to create a better end product. So any thoughts that you guys might have, would love to hear them.
I can't think of any projects I know of. Then again, I only know of 3.
Well, so let me, rather than specific to the projects you're working on, let me ask, because I don't know Angular and I don't know a lot of how you guys work with your individual projects, how are you managing content right now? What are you using? Are they more of a homegrown or specific to the project, or is there a lot of content being managed? How is that done?
I'd say it depends on the system. I mean, because like some of the cast stuff I'm doing, it's all built into cast, but now I'm consuming REST endpoints, just writing native JavaScript to consume it. But it could be Angular or something else. But in theory, I guess you could take those UIs, and if there was a Drupal backend, and switch the front end to point to a Drupal instance, and then consume roughly the same data, as long as the endpoints and the JSON is the same. So I could see an instance where, like you were saying earlier, where you might use the smaller version of Drupal. I probably can't think of the name of it off the top of my head. But have some, like where you maintain the content by using this, but then you go write a small website in Angular or React or whatever that would consume it, and then kind of have them in 2 different locations or whatever. That way you don't have to worry about the full tech stack of having Drupal on a web server.
Yeah, and that was my ideal presentation that I was hoping to get to, that I just ran into, unfortunately, too many roadblocks to get there. But was essentially any size of a website could be created in straight HTML, CSS, and then added, add Drupal content through either through Angular or just through jQuery, basically pulling the data in and displaying it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of possibilities there if they make sense.
Kind of my thoughts around it is that anything you'd probably want to use Angular for, I mean, I don't know if Drupal would necessarily be a good fit, because most often it's not necessarily like you just want to pull out some content and display it. It's like you want to be able to modify that, post it back, and I feel like what you probably end up doing is re-implementing some of those, at least for the content management stuff. Like those interfaces are already there in Drupal itself.
Yeah,
and I don't know
maybe-
if Angular's a good.
But you can simplify it. So you can kind of dumb the interface down. Because like you said, Drupal's designed more for the developer.
True.
So you get, a front desk person that's updating, who's in the office, who's out of the office. You have a simple UI.
So maybe
Yeah,
like
you could go
Angular
create a
would-
view like that in Drupal, but now you're having to code the PHP and everything to do the view and piece everything together, or you can just throw together Angular. Another item I just thought of would be kind of along that lines is if you wanted to write a mobile app, native app.
Right.
Okay, you could go write all that Angular and then hit the Drupal backend and consume the web service. Then you can add, remove things as needed instead of hitting a mobile website or something.
Well, right, but I mean, at that point, Drupal's kind of just a database front
Yeah.
end.
But to me, that's the whole point of the Headless Drupal is basically it's content management system only. It's not a display system.
Yeah.
It's not a view layer. So you're taking the view layer completely off of it. But Chuck, just curious, is there a performance, have you noticed a performance difference? Like, for example, like Unicon using Drupal for their site. So if we were to switch it over to using Headless and write the front end and something, have you noticed any statistics on that, if it's fast performant or anything like that?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think it would be much more performant. I don't have statistics, but essentially you're loading static files and then pulling in the data after. I think that's a large part of what people are excited about the headless approach. One of the big things about Drupal 8 that it does a lot better than in the past is its ability to cache, and not just cache for the anonymous users and provide static data for the anonymous users, but also for authenticated users. It tries to isolate data that is specific to a user and cache everything else. So if you're looking at the page in front of me right now, this page is going to be the same for every user, except for the My Account link is going to be different for me. And my name is written on there. My things like that might be specific to me as a logged-in user. So they have cache tokens, and they put a token within the cache, and then pull the cache out, replace the tokens with your specific data, and then render that. So the performance is greatly improved. One of the biggest challenges with Drupal is that because it is so flexible, it's the way that it manages data is not ideal, because you have a different table in the database for every field. So you're having to do joining a lot of content and things like that. To make sure that that's not an issue, it does cache heavily, and it does give you the ability to keep things very streamlined and performant. The fact that this is used by some very large websites and some that do require authentication. I think Drupal.org itself has hundreds of thousands of users, and it managed to stay up and do fairly well.
So Chuck, do you know of any sites that are currently running in this way? I mean, I can think of one example, but it's a really extreme example because they took Headless to new heights with what they did. But do you have any sites that do you know that are running this way?
Not fully headless. I don't know of any that are doing fully headless. A lot of sites have that hybrid approach where they are rendering they're rendering the user-specific content after the fact. They're loading the static page and then coming back and grabbing the user-specific content to render. I know of a few sites that are doing that for performance. But I think, it's interesting. There's a lot of discussion and a lot of buzz about headless. I think it applies a lot to mobile app development and things like that. It opens a lot of possibilities, but that's why I kind of threw out the question, because while it's really cool, where does it fit in? Where does it make sense? And I think a lot of people are wondering that.
So if you want to bring up a really extreme case, bring up lullabot.com. This basically is, and I don't understand all of this, but they're a decoupled isomorphic approach using React, Node.js, CouchDB, and Drupal as the underpinnings of this site now. So they wanted and there's an article about why they did what they did if you really want to read further into it, but they wanted their developers to have complete freedom to design their pages as they wanted, but they didn't want to lose the underpinnings of the content that they have for this site. And it's been talked about quite a bit in the community because it went to such an extreme. I mean, they went to, I guess, CouchDB is like the NoSQL approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there are a lot of layers that they put in here. I actually heard a podcast about them talking about why they did what they did. But this is just one example, and the main reason was complete freedom to design the site how they wanted.
So then what are they using Drupal for?
All the content underneath. If you go up to the upper right hand, there's all the different sections, articles, podcasts, so that all the database information and content's coming from.
So that's being managed by the Drupal front end. Mm-hmm. Like if you want to go admin this site,
yes.
you go to Drupal.
Yeah.
What about security features? Like if you put Drupal behind the firewall or something, but you only open up the API paths.
Yeah, I mean, this is all REST, using all REST apps. Yeah, I can't speak to that, but
I'm just wondering if Chuck or anything like that. So basically, you just have your website. It's only public. That's all just HTML, JavaScript. But then the only access to your API route. If you try to get to the Drupal admin pages, it just turns a 404. Mm-hmm. Turn on the network or something.
Yeah, there's a lot of possibilities, a lot of security issues and performance and things like that. One thought that I had that I would love to pursue is just the ability to separate managing content from building a simple website, because if you're building that small mom and pop website for your donut shop or whatever, you can take it to a college kid who can do something in Photoshop and put up a very basic website, but then all the content is right into the HTML, and there's very limited, dynamic element there. If you could take the alternative to that is going into Drupal, and then you have all the overhead of working in a CMS. If you could find that balance where the content could be managed in a CMS that you don't have to manage, meaning there's a service that provides the CMS, and then all you have to do is include a JavaScript file in your HTML, and then all that content gets pulled in. Again, this is all hypothetical. I'll stop rambling on what could be done. But
No, I can see several use cases like that. You have your design department that works on design, and then basically say, okay, you have the front end developers say, okay, here, basically wire it up. The designers can go and move things around how they want to. So,
and speaking directly to that, in the projects that we've done, or that I've done over the past couple of years in Drupal here, the biggest problem we've had is we come in long after the design has been done, and if we get lucky and they use a Drupal design shop that understands Drupal, they've done it in the way that allows us to recreate what they're asking. The thought occurred to me while you were talking, Chuck, is that this really frees the designers to do whatever they want and match up, and then it's just really wiring up the underpinnings of that and the performance. I mean, that's really where you gain here on the website. Is kind of it's the front end developers are no longer constrained, right?
yeah, well, I mean, I was even thinking like doing the WordPress stuff. It's okay, trying to apply a WordPress theme, but if you want to change it, you're just stuck. Your hands are kind of tied to their code format, their code bloat, and then just trying to get things to work where, somebody uses something like this, like I just said, you separates or frees up the designer to do what they want to do. So,
yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I was wondering if WordPress has done headless at all, and I came across a different article about just CMS in general and what you gain from going headless. So, but it seems to be the buzz, and it's gained traction in the last two DrupalCons that I've gone to.
And interestingly, I think it was not this past year, but the year before, in the keynote at DrupalCon, they talked a lot about, Dries talked a lot about different devices. So right now we're accustomed to managing or viewing our websites and our applications on either a phone or a tablet or a laptop or a desktop, and how as this data gets smaller, as our devices get smaller, whether it's a watch or glasses or anything like that, you don't want to deal with a large rendering process. You want simple data that's going to be presented by Google, because they're going to be the masters of what is shown and how it's shown, and you're providing data. And that's where this type of environment where you are just providing an API where they can pull that data and render it any way they need to is potentially where things are going in the future. Anyway, I think we've got a little bit distracted from, maybe not, but any other questions or thoughts? And unfortunately, I need to jump off in about 10 minutes, so we have a few more minutes. Any other questions on this? Okay.
Anybody online?
All right, good.
Okay, well, thanks, Chuck. Stop the broadcast.